Joined today by my other older brother, Bracken to talk about John Colter, America's ultimate and first mountain man. I hope you all enjoy it. This is the United States of Grit.
If we look to the answer as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. The price for this freedom at times has been high, but we have never been unwilling to pay that price. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look.
Okay, well, Bracken, I'm excited to have you on today and talk about John Colter here. Quite a cool guy. I'm excited to get into it with him, but before we start, I kind of want you to just tell a little bit about yourself and I guess who you are.
Yep, so I'm Bracken. I am Walker's older brother. I guess the second oldest brother. I'm born and raised in northern Utah. I have married, have a couple kids, 2 boys, 3 years old and 8 months old, so keeps me busy. I work for a general contractor. I'm an estimator, so work kind of in the construction world and enjoy that. It's pretty interesting, fun place to be. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Well, like I said, excited to have you on. It's always cool to have both of your older brothers on and talk about the things that I guess inspire them and that they find intriguing. So really excited to talk about John Colter here. I guess to start out, John Colter, your oldest boy, was somewhat named after him.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, yeah. So my oldest son's name is Colter, and John Colter is where I got the idea or inspiration for Colter. I can't say that I knew very much at all really about John Colter when I named him Colter, but I knew that he, I had heard some things about him, and he was an explorer up in the Yellowstone area and the Grand Teton area. Obviously, there's Colter Bay at Jackson Lake. That probably most people, when they hear of Colter, that's what they're familiar with, is Colter Bay at Jackson Lake. So that's kind of where the idea came from, and I love that part of the country. Like, just those areas are really cool places to me. So that's kind of where the inspiration came from. And then once we actually named him Colter, I was like, I better find
you better learn
something out about this guy.
Better make sure he was a good dude.
Son after, and really, I still don't know. He could have been, what kind of character he really had, other than definitely just a tough dude.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I'm really excited about this one because, well, first of all, I mean, if you read about John Colter, and after you listening to this, I would really encourage you to go and read all that you can about him. It's kind of hard because there's actually no writings from Colter himself. So it's all stories from other people and accounts of people that were with him. So that's kind of the hard thing. But something that when I first learned about him, because I didn't learn about John Colter until your son was born, and I heard about him then at that point. And once I started learning about him, I thought, why isn't this guy somebody I learned about in school?
Yeah. Like
growing up, you look back at all the historical figures that they, taught you about in school, and obviously important figures to learn about. But, the more I've looked into this and, these different mountain men and people, I kind of am a little upset that they didn't talk more about this growing up in school. Because this was somebody, in my opinion, to look to as really a role model, as a source of inspiration for a young kid, especially young men growing up.
Absolutely. I agree. I didn't know anything about him, and I remember in school learning about mountain men and maybe people in this area that we're from,
Utah area
or whatever. But I didn't really learn a lot about these guys in school, and I've since then learning about this stuff to me at least is like way more intriguing than.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously other important things to learn about in school that aren't necessarily as intriguing to everyone, but like learning about the mountain men and the exploration of the West and just how the country expanded west is super intriguing to me. And I think there's a lot you can learn from guys like John Colter. Maybe where there's not, like there's no real writings from him. Like we don't know anything really from him, but through the research you do, and he was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, so obviously they have a ton of recordings and writings, and just learning like just resiliency and toughness and like how to be independent and handle yourself, right? Like I think there's a lot you can learn from guys like him, and through some of the stories that I've been able to learn of him. And I still don't know a ton about him, but nobody really does, right? Like there's a lot of books, or if you look online, like there's a lot of things like almost folklore about him, because there's no real documentation from him of what happened. Like most of the stories you hear about him are past, it's from a writing or journal from someone who met him and talked with him, and then they're writing, and it's like, who knows, along the way what got exaggerated or what was actually true or what was just misinterpreted or whatever. But what we do know about him, there's some pretty cool stuff. Yeah.
And I guess to start out, we kind of want to go back. Obviously, you always want to start at the beginning of somebody's life, but the thing is, we really don't know anything about Colter's early life at all. There's really nothing that we know. We know he was born in Virginia. Don't really know the exact date he was born. They don't even know the exact year, but I think they predict it was between 1770 and 1775. But really where his story gets started is he is hired on the Lewis and Clark expedition to go west to the Pacific, and he was hired on as a scout and a hunter, I believe, right?
Yeah, so that's kind of where you first learn about John Colter. Like there's no recordings of his life really up until that point, but obviously Lewis and Clark documented everything, and it was a federally funded expedition essentially, right? So
and obviously he probably lived quite an extraordinary life before that, because I think it was Meriwether Lewis like purposely sought him out for that job. So obviously he had a lot of experience and knowledge. So who knows, like what kind of life he lived. Obviously he had a massive sense for adventure and wanted to experience a lot of those things. So that's where it starts. And he was a hunter and a scout for Lewis and Clark. I think there were a few incidences, where they would basically send him out to go find some other scout or someone who got lost or got left behind or didn't, and he would go out and he just kind of time and time again could just prove himself or go find food. Or they'd send him ahead to go find the Indian tribes as well. To try to talk and communicate with them. That would be a daunting task.
Especially, you don't know these tribes, and some are friendlier than others, but he was really good, able to kind of influence, like work with the Indians well, and they helped the Lewis and Clark expedition obviously immensely through that. And he would kind of go ahead of the party and kill food for him, so once the party caught up, there would be whatever kind of game that he had there ready for him.
One interesting story that I read about right as they started their expedition, so they weren't even far enough west that there weren't any trading posts left. So they were somewhere near a trading post still, so they hadn't gone too far. But Colter and somebody else in the company, they were supposed to go out. I don't know if it was hunting or scouting, but they ended up going to one of the trading posts to basically a tavern and drinking. And they got reprimanded for that. And this was a government job. So I think he actually even got court-martialed. And but I think one of the cool things, maybe one of the earliest lessons you can take from Colter, is that he did apologize, acknowledged his wrongdoing, and promised he would never do it again. And if you read about Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, he was one of their most trusted guys throughout the rest of the expedition. So the fact that he made a mistake, but he promised, I'm done with that, I'll never do it again, and turned around and became one of the most influential figures on that expedition to help them reach the goal of the Pacific.
Absolutely. And obviously, I mean, just knowing who he was and like what he did, I mean, he was a rough guy, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sure he liked taverns and liked to drink or whatever it is, but yeah, he was very influential and very dependable. I think is a lot of things I've gathered from him, like even in an expedition like that, which is, one of the biggest for this country at least, like massive expedition, right? Up till today, like just the growth of the country, and like he had a huge influence. You don't hear a lot about him, but he was a major part of that. And Meriwether Lewis, had a lot of good things to say about him.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, and it's even to the point where we know so little about him. Like, we don't even know if he was, we don't know if like he was illiterate or not.
Yeah,
we don't know. We know, I guess there's a signature, so at least we know he knew how to sign his name.
Yep.
But one thing I found interesting was that he learned a sign language that virtually all of the native tribes knew. So he could virtually communicate with all the natives.
Yeah.
Because he knew this sign language.
Yeah, and I mean, as we get further into his story, that was kind of where a lot of like his fame of exploring all these untouched territories at that time, and kind of daunting territories of like Yellowstone and Teton National Park now, but all these hot pots and Colter's Hell kind of is what they call it now. But he really, like, the purpose of him doing all of that was to go out at the time, and maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but for the fur trading company, the Missouri Fur Trading Company that he worked for, like his job was to go out from this fort that they had set up to go basically notify all of the Indian tribes within hundreds of miles that there was a fort that they could come trade at. So that was like, obviously he had some sort of pull and some sort of connection with the Indians and the Native Americans to be able to do that, and for them to give him that assignment. So
I guess with his Lewis and Clark expedition, I mean, do we know that much about the journey itself with Colter's involvement as far as stories and things, or I mean, is there any, I guess, other details we really know about it?
Yeah, like not, and I guess if you the more you dig, maybe the more you could find, but not anything like super specific. It, in my mind, other than like what we talked about, like he was just dependable. Like they needed food, he would go get it. They needed a scout to go scout out or talk to the Indians. Like he was kind of the guy to go do those types of things.
Yeah.
But as far as like other stories, unless I know you've done some research too, like if you have any, but from what I like can gather, like there's not a lot of information, right? Like
other than, you have, in, Lewis and Clark's journals, they kept, it was a very documented journey.
Yeah.
So, him being mentioned, periodically throughout their journals and things.
Yep.
But one story that I thought was really cool from it is once they got to the Pacific, they actually then had to basically bunker down for winter up there. And, the Northwest area during wintertime, it's cold and it's really, really wet. And so they were struggling for a while just to keep dry, and then food was really scarce. Yeah, obviously. But there was one story where basically they'd sent the entire party out to go and to find some kind of food because they were running pretty short. And everybody, went out for hours and hours, and everybody came back, and nobody had gotten anything except John Colter came back with, I think it was like a handful of rabbits and a deer. Yeah. Just himself, yeah. Yeah. So obviously he was a great hunter as well. Yep. So I thought that story was really cool, but it's crazy to think that the Lewis and Clark expedition, like, is as big as that was in our country's, history and things, like, that really wasn't the pinnacle of the John Colter story.
No, that was like just the beginning. Like, yeah. Like really, if you study about John Colter, like we'll mention, like if you Google him, like he'll mention he's a part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but that's like not even hardly anything that he actually did and what he's now known for. Right. But just a thought I had, like telling that story, because I hadn't heard that story, but researching and reading some books about him, I've heard other stories like that. And just another thing about John Colter is, as I've learned about him and heard stories of him, like, I mean, I think his whole life was just in like intense life and death situations, right? Yeah. Like something that would just anyone today would just be so overwhelming, and you panic and stress and not know what to do. But like, and we weren't there and we don't have his direct writings, but like it seems like he was just so cool and collected, like under pressure in any of these situations, whether it's they're starving in the winter, right? And he's like, well, goes and gets it done, or Indians are attacking him or chasing. Like he just is able to thrive in whatever situation he was in. And I'd like to like learn more. Be interesting to understand more of his demeanor and what characteristics gave him that quality.
Yeah. Well, and he obviously thrived off of that, and I think he sought that adventure out.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And because at least that we know of, once he went on the Lewis and Clark expedition, that was the last time that he ever was on the east side of the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. He never went back over the Mississippi River again. And so kind of to continue on with his story, he does this whole Lewis and Clark expedition. They're on their way back, and they're back into where they're, by these trading posts. They're getting closer and things.
Yeah.
I think they had it was like 2 months left to actually get back to, the United States, what it was at the time. But he had some guys at one of these trading posts that they were going that way.
They were on their way out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, and I might be wrong. It may not even have been necessarily at a trading post, but they were like, they kind of
passed paths or something.
Past camps at like on the river, right? And think about like John Colter and how long they've been on this expedition. Like, I don't even know how long was the Lewis and Clark expedition, but they've been in the wild of wilds. Like the wild today is nothing compared to what it was then. Like just uninhabited, like no trail, no nothing, right? They're just, and he's been out there for how long? And so they're on their way back, and they pass these basically two guys who were going out as trappers. And John Colter is basically like, hey, I want to go with these guys. Like, I don't want to go back to civilization. I want to go back out. Like, I want more adventure. So, they Lewis and Clark like allow him, basically decommission him and say, yep, you're good to go. I don't know if that's the right word. I'm trying to.
They gave him basically like a honorable discharge.
Yeah, discharge. That's the word.
But it was just a little less than 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Was that journey? And the other crazy thing is, like, these men are almost back. Like, once they get back, they're going to be celebrated as heroes. Like, imagine walking into these cities,
right?
Like and people will be lining the streets,
Ocean.
Cheering them. Like, and Coulter's like, I could care less. I want to go back,
trap some beavers.
Yeah,
Like, and I don't even know if we really know his motive for doing that. Like, he just wanted to go back out and go explore more and trap beavers, and so
so they
discharged him, and he took off with those guys and went back the way that they had come.
So it's from here that the Colter story really it's this part of his story beginning right here that it made him John Colter, the guy that everybody thinks is super super cool and a stud,
right?
So I guess let's what from this point after the expedition he leaves early, and then
so
what happens now?
So he goes off with these two guys, and I'm not great with names. I just read their names, actually. I can't remember what their names were. But he goes off with them. He traps with them for a while, but eventually kind of just, I think they even wanted to go back, and he kind of separates himself from them. So he's kind of a loner, just in the wilderness for a while until he joins up with the Missouri Fur Trading Company, right?
And the two guys, it was Forrest Hancock and Joseph Dixon.
Yeah.
That's who it was, yeah.
Yep. So he was with them for a while and trapped, and they explored some other tributaries and went some different routes and kind of were trying to find good trapping area, obviously, because beaver pelts were very valuable at the time, right? And there was a lot of money and motive for going. Like that's why a lot of the mountain men did what they did, right? Is to go trap beavers and ended up exploring in that process. But yeah, so he's learning like the lay of the land and the country and good trapping areas doing that, and he eventually teams up with the Missouri Trading Company, right? And that's basically a massive company basically that sends expeditions out to go trap beaver and get beaver pelts, and they come back and sell them. And It was out of St. Louis, but they sell them, and I think they would even sell them, like, go over to Europe, and it just was a big thing, right? So he joins up with them, and they end up going to, it's near Billings, Montana. I think it's off the Yellowstone River.
Okay.
But they set up a fort, basically, with this trading company, and Manuel Lisa was the guy's name, who was basically I don't know if he owned the trading company, but he was kind of running these expeditions and these things. So they set up this fort out in the wilderness, but they're in good trapping area, good trapping company or country, but they need to trade with people, right? Like, yeah. So, and they're in the middle of nowhere at the time. So they charged John Colter to go out and notify all the Indian tribes that he's aware of and that he can find that there's a fort there. There's a trading post there, so the Indians can come trade and barter and trying to get them to come to this fort. So he heads out, and like this, like, I don't know, winter just didn't phase this guy, because no. Right, like, yeah, like we've been up. If you've been to Jackson Hole in the wintertime, like it's not like it's a lot of snow. It's cold. It's right, and he's just by himself, like exploring these areas. But first he heads out from their fort and heads. There's a couple areas that he explores, but he kind of heads south towards Cody, Wyoming. And this is where, from the research that I've done, and maybe you've heard of like the term Colter's Hell, right? Yeah. And a lot of, you know, people say Yellowstone is Colter's Hell just because of the geysers and things like that. But from research I've done, and obviously Yellowstone has a part in that too, but he first came across like these hot pots and these geysers and all this thermal activity near Cody, Wyoming, on the
Stink River, isn't that what it's called?
The Stinking Waters is what they called it. Like it was
because of all the sulfur, because of all the sulfur, and so that's they ended up naming it that. Yeah,
right. And so he's exploring it, and they think now, if you go, I've kind of tried to map this out, but as you head west out of Cody, kind of southwest, it goes through like a little pass, and then there's the Buffalo Bill Reservoir, which obviously is a reservoir now, but at the time it didn't exist. But going through that pass, like into that canyon, like that was like thermal activity, right? And it was, John Colter didn't know what it was. Like, right. He thought literally he saw hell, you know, like what is going on? Just like these hot pots and burning water, and like, I don't know. It would be interesting to like know what he was thinking at the time, or like how he goes about, like, he doesn't know what it is. Like, what if he like sticks his hand in the water, you know, like what? Well, how does it not burn him? How does it?
From what I've read, the reason the name Colter's Hell came about was because when he went back after exploring to his, you know, his the fort, the men really didn't believe him. They're kind of making fun of him. So they're like, oh, okay, this place sounds like Colter's Hell, and
right, because he's telling them like there's like fire coming out of the earth, right? Which like he doesn't know any better. There's like boiling hot water just like spewing out of the ground. Old Faithful, yeah, like they've never seen anything like this. So that's kind of where it started, and there's still remnants of some geysers and some hot pots just kind of off that highway there, from what I've read, which is thought to be like that's kind of at the time.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was on this specific trip that he went on. It probably wasn't, because anyways, I read about one, and it was a 500-mile trip that he went on just by himself, and it was in the dead of winter, like in the middle of winter, and he went through Yellowstone and he went through the Tetons during that trip, and like in the dead of winter, like up in the mountains there, like it's, I don't know, 30 below. Yeah, like it's how he did that and survived, but like, you know, willingly did that and probably volunteered, like, yeah, I'll go do that, sounds like a good time.
Yeah, it's
unreal.
Yeah, so it's kind of this whole expedition that we're talking about was part of that, and as I've read some books, I read this book called John Colter, His Years in the Rockies, It's by Burton Harris, and Burton Harris kind of grew up in that like Cody, Wyoming area, and so he got super interested because there was nothing about John Colter. So he did a ton of research and was just trying to connect the dots between like Lewis and Clark's writings and other explorers' writings and people who crossed paths with John Colter, trying to map out basically his route. And so that what you alluded to was kind of all one big trip for John Colter, like going out, just seeking out these Indian tribes. And so, he came through Cody, Wyoming, and then believed to have dropped kind of through the Wind Rivers, down into like Du Bois, Wyoming, and then headed up towards the Grand Teton National Park. And I think they believe that he, at least this is a theory, that he kind of cut through kind of where by Jackson, over Jackson Pass, over onto the west side of the Tetons.
So like Driggs, Teutonia.
Yeah, Driggs, Teutonia area. And I honestly think this is like one of the reasons I like is so interested in John Colter in this area, is just because Dad like grew up there, and like all growing up, he just loved it, right? Yep. He lived there till he was like 5. But
well, that's why me too. Like, I hear about John Colter now. I'm like, man, he was the first really that we know of white guy that set eyes on Yellowstone and the Teton area. Yeah. Like imagine walking into that. Like nobody else from, the civilized eastern part of the United States at this point has seen this or set eyes on this. What he was thinking in his head, like, man, like our country doesn't even know what this else is on this land that we live on. Yeah, it's pretty interesting what he did. But so they believe that he passed over Teton Pass or Jackson. I don't know if it's Jackson Pass or Teton Pass. It's Teton Pass. Over onto the west side, because I think in the 1930s, I believe it was, there was a farmer plowing his fields in Teutonia, right, which is just north of Driggs, and he came across a stone or a rock, basically, that had inscribed in it JC, and then I don't remember the date, maybe like 1807 probably. I think it was. Yeah. And so they're just trying to figure out, and there's things like, well, is this a hoax or whatever it is? But that was the area that he was in, right? That was the time frame he was in the area. So I think that, it's believed that is a stone maybe from John Colter. Yeah. So evidence that he was, he went over onto the west side of the Tetons and was in that area, and then traveled back, and that's when he went back onto the east side of the Tetons, and that's when he went north, like past Jackson Lake, Colter Bay, all of that area, and ended up going exploring all the way up into what's now Yellowstone. Man, the kind of shape that a guy like him had to have been in is like unreal. Like you look at your superstar athletes in today's world, and the phenomenal things that they can do, but like, can they do that all day, every day for months, even years on end, like without stopping? Yeah. Like, because, Colter, every day he was up, hiking up the Tetons or whatever it might be. And was we're going to get to, Colter's run. Like, too, like, in the winter, like on snowshoes, in who knows how deep of snow, like, this is bad dude, man. Like, man, we're so weak now. That's like not easy country. Like, no. Like, have you ever seen the Tetons? Yeah. Like that's it's incredible to me. Like, how did he do that? Like, nowadays, like, someone gets lost in that wilderness in the wintertime for a day or 2 days and they're done for, right? And John Colter's, he's out there with what he owns on his back, and a rifle and a rifle, and his buckskin, and like, I don't know. It's kind of hard to believe, really. Like, how did he do that? But a testament just to his like fortitude, right? And, like, I don't know, like how resilient he is. Yeah. And how resilient, I think a lot of it is just mindset too, right? Like, he's a human like us. Yeah. Right? Like, how resilient can we be if we really choose to be and put our minds to it? And
Right. I'm not saying like go out into the middle of the mountains by yourself in the winter and
Right. Well,
but like, right, we get put in tough situations. How do we respond?
Well, yeah, we live in a day and an age where it's it's celebrated even to quit because you're having a mental struggle with the challenge or whatever it might be. Like it's celebrated that these people are going to quit. I remember my wrestling coach told me always growing up. He'd tell all of us when we're going through a hard workout, the body can do a lot more than what your mind's telling you it can.
Yeah.
And so it's all that mindset. And this had to have been so much mindset. But I think part of it, too, on this had to have been a lot of just absolutely loving what he was doing.
Yeah.
Like just a joy of being in that tough situation and doing and exploring something new. Like he had to have just gotten a thrill out of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you would have to just to do what he did, right? Like he could have gone back with Lewis and Clark, and at this point in his life, he could have just been, who knows what, what kind of lifestyle he could have been living, but he just kept choosing to go back.
Yep.
And a lot of it, go by himself. I think that's another big factor, like in his resiliency. Like he just was alone on most of these trips. So, like, I don't know if you've watched the show Alone, but, watching it, like, these people are incredible, right? Like, how they can survive in the wilderness and
right.
those things. But, like, what gets to most people is just being alone.
Right.
But he just, did it and thrived. And, we weren't there, but
right.
It sounds like he thrived and
what
spent a lot of time alone.
Crazy thing is like, on that show we're talking about, Alone, like, they stay in one spot and basically create a home out of that one spot. He was every day going somewhere new.
Right.
And having to set up, a new, temporary home. Not even a home, just a sleeping space. That's what I like when he's out in the dead of winter. Like how did he do that? I guess did he just create a little base for himself and just go? But he traveled 500 miles.
Yeah, it seems like he was
no
on
base
the
that's
move
gonna be close.
This entire time. Like was just on the move because that was the end goal, right? Like he was out there seeking out Indian tribes to get them to come trade at their trading post, right? So it's not like he had a base camp and he would just go out from there. Like he was moving. I mean, if you look at a map, I kind of have one pulled up here, like while we're talking, but you look at the distances from like what is believed where he traveled. Like Billings to Cody, Wyoming is a good distance, and then Cody over to the Grand Tetons, and then I mean, hiking over Teton Pass at the time when it wasn't a road, right? Like it's
forged his own trail,
wilderness, right? Like that's not easy. And then going back and going all the way up. So he goes past through Jackson Lake, and he kind of gets on some Indian trails and stuff at this time, and is following them, and heading over towards Yellowstone and Yellowstone Lake. But from what I've read too, like as he goes north, like some of these trails weren't great either, because it seems like a lot of the Indians maybe even shied away from some of the areas in Yellowstone and stuff as well. So he was kind of going into like this really sketchy area, like these natives aren't even...
From what I've read, the natives in a lot of areas in Yellowstone were scared to go over there because they thought it was, some type of gods that were...
Right, which,
because, the ground, the geysers coming up, like... they didn't understand that it was, the way that the earth was working in that area. They thought it was, some form of deity that was angry or something.
Angry,
yeah. So they didn't want to go near it.
Yep.
So that's why they stayed away from it.
And he's like following these trails, but obviously they're getting thin. But he's still just going like, oh, I want to see it, right? Like just the mindset that he had, like even these natives who thrive out there in the wilderness, like he's going kind of where they shy away from.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this original journey that he had, he ends up going, he kind of tops, I think it was called Chicken Ridge, but I don't remember for sure, so don't check me on that. But that's where he gets a view of Yellowstone Lake and kind of can see all that, and he ends up going up and around Yellowstone Lake, up above it, because he's got to find somewhere to pass, cross the river. And he ends up crossing and heading back over kind of towards Wyoming or Cody, and then up.
I wonder how
Billings,
because we know
back to the fort.
We know there's a lot of bear up there now. I mean, what it was at that time.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I wonder. Like,
I'm sure they were there.
Yeah.
I mean, think about a grizzly bear. Like, nowadays, right, a grizzly bear's main threat is man, right, and us infringing on their habitat. But back then, right, like what threat did a grizzly bear have?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm sure he came across them.
Yeah. Well, even if you shot a grizzly bear with a gun, especially the guns they had back then, like, yeah, you kill one, but if it was charging you and you shot, that grizzly was going to do some damage to you before you died. Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's plenty of stories of mountain men, right?
Yeah, Hugh Glass.
Yeah, exactly. Hugh Glass. So, yeah, I'm sure he came across them. That's another thing that I think of, just like not only the landscape that he was traversing through, but just the animals that he had to deal with. And obviously this journey through, a lot of it was through the winter, so maybe bears weren't, as much of an issue because they were in hibernation and stuff. But then you think about wolves and you think about whatever else was out there. And he went and did it alone, which was pretty cool. Like, I think just the mindset that he had, like the resiliency that he had is just makes me think, like, well, if I'm in a tough situation, like, how resilient am I really, right?
Yeah.
Like I can do a lot more than maybe I think that I can.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's always been like, that resiliency, it's been like a tough workout or something. Like, I'm resilient. I got through it. Like, I pushed through it. Like, I was going hard at the end too. Like, I didn't give up. And then, like, you look at this story and you're like, they would have just laughed at me. Like, this was your resiliency story?
Yeah, you get done with your workout
what
and
is
then you
this?
go take a hot shower and drink Gatorade and go sleep on a nice Tempur-Pedic mattress, right? Like, it's just... And obviously, like, lifestyle now is so different, and I'm not... Like, I don't know if I would want to live completely like his lifestyle. It'd be cool to explore and be the first person to see these places. That's something I think about all the time when I go to new places. Like, man, what was this like when it was like first discovered? Like, before it was touched by like touched by man and had.
Well, yeah, I think that just about our hometown here.
Yeah.
Like, I wish I could have seen what it looked like before it had been touched. But now we're talking about one of, like, the greatest wonders of the world in Yellowstone.
People travel all over the world to come see,
and being the first one to see
Yellowstone.
that.
Yeah, pretty cool. Like, it'd be cool just to, like, talk to him and actually hear some of, like, his experiences and his stories. But obviously this all comes from kind of second, third party, right? Like, just people who spoke to him or heard things from him or heard things about him.
Or we're with him on some of these
we're with him on
expeditions.
So
I guess now we kind of his relationship, from all accounts, he had really good relationships, it sounded like, with majority of all these Indian tribes.
Yeah.
You alluded to it earlier, like, he, the fur trapping company would send him out, and so he had to have had some really good form of just being somebody that communicated really well and was just probably a trustworthy guy, in order for these, native tribes to trust him and become friendly with him. But kind of, I guess, jumping now towards Colter's run, that story, leading up to that, obviously there's going to be some hostility with, it really just is one tribe.
Yeah.
Is it the Blackfeet?
Yep.
The Blackfeet tribe. So I guess his first run-in with them Colter was actually with... His group was with the Crow Indians, and I think it's the Flathead Indians.
Yeah.
And they were together, and I don't know if it was they were just exploring, or
I don't
what
remember,
it was exactly they were doing.
I don't remember what it was they were together, but obviously they were friendly.
Yeah, and they were doing something on this expedition together. But he was with, like, it was like 800 Crow and Flathead Indians he was with, but then these Blackfeet. From what I've read, it was around 1,500 of them suddenly attacked him.
Yep.
Colter's actually injured in this. He gets it was either an arrow or a bullet to the leg he took. But then luckily the Crow and the Flathead Indians, they fight off the Blackfeet and send them in retreat. Yep. So that was, I think, at least from all the accounts that we can find, his first negative run-in with a native tribe.
Yeah.
I'm sure he probably had some others. I can't imagine he didn't.
I'm sure there were.
But this was the first significant one, at least that's documented.
Yep. And it kind of sets up probably one of the things Colter's most famous for. Like if you Google John Colter, you're going to hear about Colter's run. And it's almost like folklore, right? There's so many different theories or versions of the story.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they were kind of and I think a lot of that battle that you talked about was just based off of territory and whose land was whose land, and
They were
Blackfeet,
probably trapping, and
yeah,
they
the
thought was
Blackfeet
theirs.
felt threatened that like, hey, they were in their territory because they kind of moved out of the Yellowstone area that Colter had initially explored and up more towards like the Three Forks, Montana area. So that was the initial run in with the Blackfeet, you could say. But then, I mean, John Colter being John Colter obviously goes back. Goes back to that area because there was in the Three Forks area in Montana, there was it was just a good trapping area. I mean, there's Three Forks, come together and a lot of good rivers to trap there. So he goes back with, and remind me the name. I know
John Potts.
John Potts, that's right. So they're trapping in that area, and kind of the story goes, I think that they're in a canoe, right, canoeing up the river, and some Blackfeet basically ambush them, sneak up on them, and initially they're just in the river. Blackfeet, are threatening to kill them. And so I think John Colter's going over to the banks of the river to maybe try to make amends or try to figure out how to get out of this situation.
Or surrender in some way that's not going to end with his life right there
on
the river. Yeah.
Right. And we don't know exactly the details, but I think John Potts kind of grabs for his rifle, which is a natural reaction, and Blackfeet feel threatened, and they shoot John Potts right there,
Yeah, what I've read is that, Colter got out of the canoe, was basically surrendering himself to him. Potts wasn't going to go down, basically, without a fight. And I think one of the Indians actually shot an arrow at Potts, and I think it might have hit him, but it didn't kill him, it just wounded him.
Right.
And then Potts fired his gun and killed
that Indian.
Yep. And then I guess from what Colter told some people later was that then basically all the Indians right there just returned fire, and he said his whole body was just full of arrows, and he just dead there on the spot.
Yep. So I mean, put yourself in John Colter's shoes, right? Like you're in this hostile environment, your buddy that's just dead. You're alone again, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure he's like, okay, well, I'm dead. Like, there's nothing I can do now. I've essentially surrendered myself. My buddy just threatened. I'm like, but for whatever reason, the leader of this group of Indians decided, just wanted to maybe play a game or have fun with John Colter. So they strip him of everything, take all his clothes, take everything he has, and give him 100 yards, right? Like they put him out there 100 yards. Just they're kind of on this plain, and tell him to run, basically. And so he just takes off running, and obviously they didn't know, but John Colter was a great runner, and probably, like you alluded to this before, you think about everything, all the experiences he had, right? How many mountains he's climbed, so he just takes off running, and bare feet, just completely naked. And these Indians, so they give him a little bit of a head start, and then they just take off after him. So he's just running for his life, just running across this plain, just all right, this is the only thing I can do. And as you read stories, and I'm sure there's a lot of exaggeration that goes into it. Just who knows what happened, but he's actually kind of pulling away from a lot of these Indians. He keeps checking over his shoulder. But I think there's two Indians that are actually pretty close to him, and they're staying right there, and one's kind of starting to gain on him. So he's kind of separated himself, and there's really there's two of them, and one kind of falls off, and then there's one that's just a threat to him, and is gaining on him. And obviously John Colter's fatiguing and getting tired, and I'm sure his feet are all jacked up, and right,
barefoot running across that terrain, I'm sure.
Yeah. So this Indian's chasing him, and from an account that I've read, he has a spear to spear John Colter, right? The game is just chase him down.
Well, and Colter had been running so hard that, from what I've read, his nose starts bleeding.
Yeah, so he's
got
bleeding
blood all
out
over
his
his
nose.
face. Yeah,
blood all over his face, probably all over his chest. And so as this Indian gets closer to him, like, which is smart on John Colter's part, but his only option really, he just stops dead in his tracks and turns and just yells at this Indian. He's got blood all over his face. I'm sure he looked crazy, right? And it just it startles the Indian just enough that he falls and he drops his spear. And so John Colter's able to take his spear that Indian, and then take off and keep going. And that buys him enough time to get to basically to the river.
Yeah.
So he jumps in the river, and they're still not far behind him, but he's able to jump in the river.
And I'm sure they're really motivated now, seeing that their friend is dead.
Like I'm sure they run up on their
or maybe
their buddy,
they could be a little fearful now,
like,
too.
Whoa, like, who is this crazy guy? But he jumps in the river and doesn't cross the river, because he knows, like, the Indians obviously know how to track, right?
Right.
Like, he knows that his only way of survival is to stay in the water where they can't track him. Mm-hmm. So he gets in the river and is able to. I mean, some accounts will say it's a beaver dam, or some just say it's just debris built up, like a log jam on the river. But he's able to get underneath the log jam. I'll say it's a log jam, and hide under there, but keep his head above water where he can breathe. Yeah. So he basically just waits it out underneath there, like
there for hours.
For hours, he can hear the Indians outside, like, kind of looking for him, and he just waits until they basically give up. Till that night, I think.
Yeah, it's dark at this point. By the time he finally gets out.
Yeah, and he can't hear him, so he gets out, and I don't know if he swam down the river a ways, right, to just so there aren't tracks or what, but he's able to get out of there. So now he's he's in the wilderness. All of his trapping, his canoe, all of his gear is back where the Indians captured him. He's naked. Like, now it's night. He has his fort, which is a long ways away.
Yeah, I mean, he's floated the river to where he's at this point. Yep. Like, who knows actually how many miles he is away from this fort of his.
Yep. And so he's got to get back to his fort, but there's kind of a pass he has to go through between some mountain ranges to get to the fort. But he's fearful to go through the pass because he knows, like, the Indians, like, oh, it's his only way out. So if we just watch that, like, they're gonna capture him. So instead of going through the pass, he goes up and over the mountains, right? And spends the night up there. I don't know how he did it. Like, he's naked. Like, even if it's the summertime, like, it's not warm.
No,
I'm sure that water's not warm. He's soaking wet.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how he did it, but so he gets over. He crosses straight over the mountain instead of going through the pass, and is able to make his way back to the fort. And so that's like Colter's run, and that's kind of a fun story about him that's, who knows, like, folklore or not, or, I mean, there's obviously some truth to it, because he passed the story along to people who then kind of documented it or would tell the story.
Right.
And it got documented at some point.
John Potts died somehow.
Yeah, right. So, who knows, but, I mean, there's some truth to it, and it's pretty cool. Like, crazy story. Like, put yourself in his shoes. Again, back just to, like, the resiliency. Like, he just finds a way, like, like, the Indians say, okay, run, and they start chasing you, and you're like, most people, like, all right, well, I'm done, this is it. But he just doesn't. He just keeps going and figures out a way as he's going.
I read one account that said the distance that he ran, this account said that they were predicting it was around 5 miles.
Yeah, I've heard like 6 miles. So
and you might be thinking
to the
like,
river.
Yeah, you might be thinking like, well, there's tons of people in today's world that 5 miles is a breeze for them. So, yeah, but I'm sure this was an all-out sprint 5 miles. Running for his life.
Like 5 miles with a tribe of Indian warriors behind you with spears versus 5K.
Yeah,
like fun run.
Yeah. So, I mean, that stamina, basically sprinting 5 miles, that's pretty unreal.
Yeah.
And
Well, and you don't know, like, what state he was in up to that point. Like, he's been out in the wilderness track. Like, what have they been eating? Like,
Yeah.
right? Like, I'm sure food is, like...
Probably scarce.
Right? Yeah. Feast or famine, very much out there. So you don't know, like, what kind of state he was in when that started. So I'm sure a lot of it was adrenaline and...
Right.
But I'm also, like... It probably just that situation or... Like, it probably wasn't really that new of an experience for John Colter. Like, just things that he'd been through. Like, he's been through so many challenging things that it was just like, all right, like, how am I going to get it done? Like, figure out a way.
Yep, I got to rely on my my stamina to survive here, and I'm sure that wasn't the first time he had to do that. I'm sure he did that all the time. So, well, and tell me if I'm wrong, after, kind of Coulter's run, we really don't know much else about the rest of his life.
Yeah, so he, just briefly, he actually ends up going back to that Three Forks area where the Blackfeet are. And obviously the Blackfeet kind of have a sour taste for the trappers and the white men in the area, right? So it's a dangerous, anytime going into that territory is dangerous. But from what I understand, he went back one time to retrieve his trapping gear. Like, well, I guess you need that, right? That makes sense. And then he went back to with another expedition that had come out of the fort, and they wanted to go trap in that area. And he kind of warned them, like, hey, this, like, that's not a safe place, but like we'll go. And so they go out there and they end up setting up a fort, and things seem good for, I think, a couple weeks actually, and there's like no sign of Blackfeet, and they're feeling good, like, okay, we're good. And they kind of start venturing out from their fort, trapping some of these different forks and stuff, and then one of the groups is attacked and killed by the Blackfeet, and they end up having to retreat and leave the area again. And I think that was kind of John Colter's like, all right,
it's time to hang it up.
It's time to hang it up, after he takes this other group out there. And so he heads back to the fort near Billings, and then ends up going back to St. Louis, where he kind of lives out the rest of his life. I think he ended up buying just outside of St. Louis.
Some farm.
Just has a little homestead there. I think he ended up getting married, and lived out there for some time, but not long after he got back. Ended up just dying from kind of natural causes. Got sick or.
One account I read is they thought it was jaundice.
Yeah.
That he died from, but we really don't know.
Yeah. So, which is crazy. Like, you think about the life he lived, and like you said, like, most of his life was spent on the west side of the Mississippi, which was just untamed territory at the time, right? And he survives it all and doesn't die until he gets back to civilization, and kind of maybe loses some, and maybe for him, like, loses some of that sense of adventure and, like, kind of like what drove him, what he lived for, right? He's just homesteading and living that life, and maybe, it was just, he didn't quite have that drive anymore. Yeah,
well, it's surprising too that they say supposedly he died from some type of an illness. On his expedition with Lewis and Clark, they had a sick log. So anybody that was sick, they wrote it down, and John Colter was never on it.
Yeah.
So, like, he obviously had great health, probably a great immune system.
Yeah.
But yeah, you wonder if maybe it was just, and how much of that is maybe a little bit mental too,
Yeah, I don't know. Like, maybe he just kind of, that's kind of what drove him.
Yeah.
And what he, lived for, and when that wasn't there, not to say he didn't have anything to live for, but I don't know. Who knows? Like, I just sometimes wish so bad that John Colter would have kept a journal.
Yeah.
Because, like, you think about, like, so, like, if we could hear all this stuff, like, firsthand, like, it'd be cool.
Well, you think of, too, guys that nowadays that are guys that love to spend most of their time in the mountains and hunting. Yeah. How many of them write in a journal?
Yeah.
No one.
Yeah.
Like.
Yeah. Right. Like, he had, obviously, probably to him, like, more important things or better things to do than like, because to him it's just like day-to-day stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if he realized that now, right, looking back, like, those are some of the most prominent places in the country as far as wilderness goes.
And Yellowstone, the world.
Yeah, Yellowstone and the Tetons, right?
Yeah.
Like, he didn't know that. He was just doing a job.
Yeah.
You know? That's just what he was there to do. He probably didn't think anything was worth documenting.
Yeah.
You know? So, but it would have been cool to, like, hear firsthand his experiences, and more like for me, like, to understand more of his mindset and like what he was thinking and what drove him and why he did these things. And, you know, and other people weren't, like, obviously there was something about him that, like, Lewis and Clark, he was so valuable with their expedition, and then the trading company sending him out. Like, why do they send him out to go do those things, you know, versus someone else? Like, maybe one was just his willingness to go do it, but two, like, he just was able to do it, right?
Yeah.
Like, he was, I don't know, so independent, so resilient, so capable. And so, I don't know, it'd be cool to understand a little bit more about him in that regard.
Yeah. Well, he's an awesome figure, and I mean, to me, when I think of the word grit, you have to think of somebody like John Colter.
Yeah.
So to close, I want to ask you that question. It's something I'll ask everybody that's on here. Is what does grit mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just like words to me that define grit is like resiliency, toughness, mental fortitude, just being able to, like, when you're in a challenging situation or face a daunting task, just the ability to put your head down, go to work, and figure out a way to get it done, right? And I think John Colter, just from stories that we do know of him, was very much that way. Like, for a lot of people, most of the things he did were maybe impossible, right?
Right.
But he just figured out a way, right? Just was very resilient. It seems like he didn't let his, one thing my wrestling coach used to always tell us is, don't let your highs get too high, don't let your lows get too low, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he was pretty steady through some pretty stressful situations and was able to handle those. So to me, that's what grit is, like, being able to, no matter what your situation, figure out a way and accomplish a task.
I like that. I think that's cool. And I think especially with us, I think growing up with our dad, and I think just with wrestling too, I think grit's a word that's thrown out there a lot, and it's something that's desirable. It's something that you want to have.
Yeah. And
just people like John Colter here, and these figures that I want to talk about on some future podcasts, these people that displayed grit, and it ultimately shaped our nation and shaped the resiliency of our country throughout the years that, you know, our country's existed.
Right.
And so I love stories like this, like somebody, and I think the cool thing about it too is such a remarkable guy and such a stud, and like what praise has he had over the years? Like, I didn't even know who he was.
Yeah,
until
like, he didn't do it for
2-3 years ago.
The praise, right? Or accolades or anything like that. Like, he definitely had some other internal motivator or driver that wasn't for praise of man, I guess you could say.
And I think that's another thing I think can go along with grit, and something that I think is missing in our country and society today, is to do these tough things, to just put your head down and figure out a way to do it and not expect praise. Yeah. You're doing it for the benefit of yourself or your loved ones. Yep. But you don't expect any praise. You're just going to be tough and get the job done. Yeah, because it needs to get done, right? Like, that's why you're doing it, because the job needs to get done. It's not look at me or anything like that, but getting the job done. And it's easier said than done, right? Like, who doesn't like praise? Who doesn't like to be told, like, good job, or you know, like, you're really good at that. But I think people like that, like John Colter, or like you talk about just our country, founding fathers, like, it was because it was the right thing to do. You know, like, that's what they were inspired to do. It was the right thing to do. Yeah. So, Well, awesome. Thanks for jumping on here with me today. This one was really fun. Really awesome guy to talk about. So glad you're able to get on here and talk about John Colter with me. If you liked it, leave me a rating and subscribe. And until next time, thanks.